everyone should see the first slide, and basically what we wanted to do is say that in looking at your reports and listening to the presentations back in December, we really saw a lot of really nice nice proposals. But on the other hand, what we also saw was a need to kind of go over some concepts to help frame things and bring everybody together. And so what we'd like to do is to kind of share with you those ideas. So we've got 4 bullets here. The first is the one where we identified 3 working groups, 3 types of proposals, and these are really areas of focus to develop materials from. And then what we're going to do is talk about a proposed framework to help guide the work through the next semester, and then the next steps we'll take, of course. So next slide. So this is a list of the groups that we saw. The first bullet, the first group was a series of investigations with biochar and plant growth. And we listed the names of the teachers that fell into that category. And many of you were really setting up manipulative experiments of one type or another. The second group were observational or monitoring investigations that were related either to some aspect of forest ecology, the pine beetle, or something to do with the wood-based bioenergy industry. And then, of course, we have Pat, Logan, Lorianne, Doug, Sarah, and David had proposals that fit into that category. And then we had 2 proposals that were dealing with bioenergy and biofuels from an engineering type perspective. And these were Chip and Doug's proposals. And so we felt that these would make logical working groups for teachers in these groups to work together and to refine what they've proposed, and then maybe augment them or help each other implement them in one form or another. So these are the initial groupings. Having said that, the teachers are welcome to self-assign based on what they're doing, and we'll match projects and scientists with the groups. And our goal is to coordinate and collaborate to co-develop and complementary educational materials to follow these. And then we'll plan for a spring BANR teacher time, either through webinars and meetings around the different activities that emerge. So next slide. Okay, so developing the materials, what we wanted to do is develop a framework that connects the work that you're doing in the working groups with the NGSS and BANR goals and objectives. And also something in a way that can be elaborated or articulated for each group. So we'll talk a bit about the standards in a general sense, but then we'll look at each group specifically. And we're only going to use one as an example today, and that would be the biochar experiments. The framework in turn is designed to inform kind of the scope and focus of the materials. It will attend to specific scientific protocols. Well, you can read the bullets. Align the learning goals and activities with assessments, and this is really an important point, and that is the assessments. And really then to develop and pilot common assessments, and then to share the curriculum materials. Okay, so what do we mean by a framework? Well, what we'd like to do is for you to think about what you proposed in 3 different domains, and then we're going to overlay those ideas on something we should be familiar with, and that's the NGSS content standards. So we're going to look at the content domain, and that is the material, the concepts, principles, and so forth that would be aligned with what you're doing. The practice and communication domain, and then a third domain, which we're calling the cognitive or thinking domain. Now what we've done here is we've laid out 3 aspects of the NGSS work. And NGSS delineated three areas. One they called the NGSS core disciplinary ideas, and that would align very well with what we're calling our content domain. They also talked about scientific practices, which clearly overlap with the practice domain. And then they also noted that there are cross-cutting concepts. And for us, this has a lot to do with both the content and practice, but also the thinking domain. And what we mean by the thinking domain is to look at this in terms of how students come to understand concepts. And so we've kind of overlaid the thinking domain on the three different NGSS areas. And really what we're looking is kind of an increase in what we're calling metacognitive sophistication. So at the lower end, we're looking at ideas and the ways that small children or children think about ideas and what they bring to school. And then finally getting to a level where they're using what we call scientific model-based reasoning. And we will go into that in a little bit more detail. And I think you'll see why this is important at a lot of levels. So next slide. So look, we're going to unpack this framework. And the scientific model-based reasoning, we're going to look at it in terms of descriptions versus explanations, how we connect the three strands, the cross-cutting, practice, and content strands of NGSS. And then we're going to use an ecosystem example and a biochar example to elaborate on that. Okay. My mouth is starting to get dry. Beth, do you want to pick up on this? This is work here that emerged from our math science partnership that many of us are familiar with, and I'll turn it over to Beth to talk about this a little bit.
Yep, sure. Can you hear me, John?
Yep.
Okay. So when we say that we're looking for sophisticated model-based reasoning as kind of the goal for the units or the curriculum materials that we're developing, we're kind of basing this on work that we've been doing for several years now, where we've really looked at kind of how students are reasoning about the topics and the concepts that we're talking about. And our goal is kind of this model-based accounts, or thinking and reasoning that is what NGSS really defines as necessary for scientific literacy and for making informed decisions about scientific concepts and scientific issues that kids might encounter. And so scientific model-based reasoning is kind of a way of thinking about science that involves a big emphasis on how and why things are happening. So a lot of times what kids tend to do is, like very young kids tend to use these level 1 and 2 ways of reasoning, which is that they're really thinking about what's happening in the material world in terms of actors doing stuff. So they might explain the water cycle in terms of the sun dries up the water. And so it's kind of just invoking these notions of actors fulfilling their purposes, and there might be things that help them and things that hinder their actions. At a little bit of higher level, what we call level 3, and this is what kids kind of tend to get to in high school a lot, is where they're just maybe describing things that are happening, but they're not necessarily hitting on mechanisms. So I do a lot of work in water cycle, so what we see a lot is kids who are just able to explain the water cycle, or I should say rather describe the water cycle in terms of places and names of processes. So the water is in the surface and it moves to the atmosphere, and that's called evaporation, and then it moves into clouds, and that's called condensation. And so they're not really saying how or why these things happen. And so what we're looking for in what we're hoping to aim for in model-based accounts are kids really invoking scientific principles and mechanisms when they're explaining events and processes in the material world and in systems. So you do see that under the structures and systems column that there is sort of what you think of as just kind of the very factual information, like at levels 1 and 2, kids aren't necessarily as familiar with all the parts of systems, or parts of systems especially that are at different scales than macroscopic scales, so things at the cellular level or the atomic molecular level. And so that familiarity with systems does grow as students move to higher levels. But in addition to that, just sort of addition of factual information, students also kind of develop more sophisticated ways of explaining what's happening. Did you want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, so we'll have a few slides that unpack this a little bit further and then give you some visuals as to how model-based reasoning might play out for us. And a term that we often use that is related to this addresses a very special type of model-based reasoning. We refer to it as hierarchical reasoning, and we call it hierarchical reasoning because of the way in which systems are structured and the way in which principles play out at one scale and affect processes at another scale. So this model-based reasoning is really critical in understanding how to navigate through and across scales when studying a process or a phenomenon. Is going to be very important. So next slide.
Yep. And so this is just from some other colleagues, Bratton and Winchittle, kind of just another lens on a very similar thing. And they're talking about kind of this progression in the way that students describe or explain things. And on the left hand are simpler or less sophisticated ways where students are just describing what happens in an event, and they might be summarizing or restating a pattern. They might have trends, they might have data and look at relationships, but they're not kind of saying what's causing the relationships. At an intermediate level, they might be describing how, and at the higher level, they're hopefully using theory and scientific models and principles to explain the causal story for what's going on with an event or phenomenon. And John's going to give some examples of this as we move through. So Sylvia, did you want to talk about this slide? Do we have Sylvia? She's on mute.
Hello, Sylvia?
Maybe not.
There? Okay.
Okay, we'll just go ahead. And so just to think about how that connects to the next generation science standards, I think it's this goal of model-based reasoning is pretty clearly expressed in the next generation science standards, and it's evident in things like the scientific practices where developing and using models is a central practice for scientific practice that we want students to engage in. And so as we kind of work on our BANR educational materials, we're wanting to talk and think about with you guys in how we can bring these three aspects of NGSS, kind of connect them to the materials that we develop. And for any one given unit or activity, there might just be one or two disciplinary core ideas that are really getting emphasized. And here we've highlighted the Colorado folks kind of went through the NGSS disciplinary core ideas and pulled out the ones that seem to fit closest with the BANR topics. And so for a unit, it might address one or two of these disciplinary core ideas, and then there might be an emphasis on certain cross-cutting concepts and one or two scientific practices in a material or lesson that gets developed. And actually, if you look at the NGSS standards themselves, they do, for each core disciplinary idea, they have suggestions for which cross-cutting concepts and which scientific practices might really fit and go together in a certain context.
This is Sylvia. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, I can. Why don't you elaborate on that?
No, you did that perfectly. And the only thing I wanted to add is that we tend to think when we're developing activities and we're aiming towards the performance expectations that NGSS points out to us, that we're really looking for the best intersection of those three different colored circles, if you will. And even while NGSS points out some what they call progressions in terms of the content areas, and those are laid out for any of you who've looked at those. What we're talking about here with this project is not just the content, but also the more sophisticated way of thinking and the more sophisticated way of building on the content by adding in the different cross-cutting concepts and practices and so forth.
And one thing I would add is that in looking at the cross-cutting concepts, you'll notice there that the idea of systems and system models, structure and function, cause and effect, these are, in a way, these are a way of thinking and looking at the world. And if you look over at the science and engineering practices, the development and use of models is listed there. And using mathematics and computational thinking, analyzing data, interpreting data, these are all highly interrelated with those cross-cutting concepts. And what we're going to talk about next is a way of framing our BANR topics that allows you to operationalize these concepts. So next slide.
Okay. Actually, this is kind of,
yeah.
Well, going back really quickly to this, I think you said it, John, but just the idea that what's reflected in these three interconnected strands of NGSS really is reflective of the scientific model-based reasoning that we're aiming for. And so this, I don't know that we need to go through these in detail now, but just to kind of help all of us as we're kind of delineating what core disciplinary ideas we may really bring to the forefront of the BANR education materials. As I said, the Colorado folks sort of went through, and it was mostly in the earth science and the life science that there were some core disciplinary ideas that stuck out as having potential for really connecting to BANRs to topics that are prominent in BANR. And we did highlight kind of, some of these are a little bit abbreviated, but what those statements are for the core ideas at the middle school and high school level. And as Sylvia noted, these aren't the standards, these are just the core disciplinary ideas, and they only really reflect the standards when you also combine them with relevant, and select scientific practices and cross-cutting concepts. So these are the earth science ones. These are the life science ones, and we can just have this document kind of as a resource to help us think about which NGSS ideas we may want to focus on.
Great. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to look at an example of how we might study an ecosystem and try to provide you with a way to kind of operationalize what we just said. So here are a couple of ideas to think about, and that when we look at a system, in this case an ecosystem, it may include multiple principles operating simultaneously and also organized in what we're going to call a dynamic and hierarchical system, or in a dynamic or hierarchical manner. So what I've done is I've listed over on the left-hand side different levels of organization. So the molecular cellular level, the individual species level, the population species level, communities with multiple species, and then this notion or concept of an ecosystem. And it's not difficult to really look at this in what we're going to call a structured or hierarchical manner, in that cells or molecules make up cells, which then comprise organelles or organs and make up individuals. Individuals, of course, are sorted into species based on their genetic makeup. Groups of individuals with similar genetic makeup form populations, and then interactive populations form communities when we define an area or region. And then when we layer how those interactions interact with the inorganic world to form organic molecules and transfer energy and matter through the system and among organisms within the system, we can look at it in terms of an ecosystem. So I've just got characters of 3 different levels. I obviously have an individual that happens to be a mite feeding on another individual. The little white guy there is a little collembola. There's a predator-prey interaction. We can then graphically represent that in a food web where we have several populations of individuals interacting in that manner. And then those interactions then help shape what we call an ecosystem. And in this case, this is looking south towards the Brooks Range up on the north slope of Alaska, so it would be Arctic tundra in this case. The little diagram below, again, is just representing how all of these basic principles from genetics and evolution all the way up through thermodynamics and systems theory interact or interrelated to one another. And when we view a system, then it's important for us to begin to think about how those principles play out across these different scales of organization. So next slide. Now, this is a study, and Yamina, are you on the phone? Is Yamina there?
Oh,
she's muted. Phone. Okay.
She's not on.
Okay, so she's not on. But this is an example of where, in this case, undergraduates are in their abilities to think in a systems context, and then also how they performed, after they had a short course in systems thinking. So we have pre and post test results. We asked them the question that's there listed under A, so the system description question. We said, using the image below, identify a system or systems, describe structural properties, functional attributes, and controls. And so this, some of you will probably remember this if you visited Fort Collins. This was in the conference room of the NREL. It's a mural of going from an arid to mesic grassland, and then some of the different biome types that you might encounter in the different organisms. And so we had the students respond to this question in essay form, and then we transcribed them, and then we scored them based on those different levels of learning that Beth articulated earlier. And most, if not all, of the students were at least at that level 3, where they were able to describe the system in a phenomenological manner. They really didn't go into much detail, though. Very few of them it did. So of the 50 or so students that we had, or 40 or so students that we had take the exam, only a couple of them really got into details in that they were able to describe the system, usually 1 or 2 systems that were present. So they might include climate, the climate system with and how it could serve as a driver to explain what's going on with vegetation in the different ecosystems, or soil processes, or they would link those in some ways, and then provide mechanisms that might explain how those interactions interacted to affect the structure of what they saw. So that would be a level 4 answer, clearly using what we called model-based reasoning. A lot of the students, a fair number early on, would define a system, and they might bring in a mechanism or 2, or they might describe a couple of systems and mention that they interacted, but really didn't go into much detail. Then after 8 weeks, the students were given the question again, showed up on their final, and we looked at the answers at that point and really saw significant growth in terms of how they were thinking about things. They began to recognize that there were more than one system at play. They saw this hierarchical structure and scale. In explaining how climate might affect plants, they would then talk about processes that were going on in soils and water availability, and how that might limit plant growth, and how limitations on plant growth might affect the organisms, the heterotrophs, in this case grazing organisms that are present or not in the system. So they really began to elaborate more on the response. Someone just jump on? No? Okay, next slide. And what we mean by this hierarchical organization and their ability to move across scale is that they keyed in on a system, and I've used the little food web as how we might, what we might key in on. And they recognize that the food web is composed of populations and trophic interactions amongst organisms, and really to explain what they're observing and the structure that they saw, how many organisms are present, and so forth, they would go to a lower level of organization and draw from that for explanatory mechanisms. Then in terms of understanding how that community or food web might shape or affect the ecosystem we call, in this case, the Arctic tundra, they would then go up in scale and they would say, okay, what are the implications of trophic interactions, herbivory, and its effect on plant growth or plant community structure, herbivory or predator-prey interactions, and the effect that it has on processes in soil and how those then might influence the growth of plants and what we see as a tundra ecosystem. So the key is that by focusing in on a scale of observation, we can go to lower levels of organization to find mechanisms and go to higher levels of organizations to look at the significance of what we're observing and the results that we get. So the next slide. I'm just pointing out here that it's really important that we identify kind of this entry level or pivotal node, if you will, within the hierarchy that's going to serve as an entry point for us. So in the two examples that we're looking at biological aspects of the BANR project, one focused in on the impact of biochar on plants and plant growth. And so that would serve as that entry point, if you will, within this system. So the question becomes then, how do we explain how biochar might affect plant growth, and what are the implications of that at a larger scale, at an ecosystem scale? The other set of studies jumped in at what I would call more of the ecosystem scale and looking at the impact of, in this case, the beetles or fire on the tree growth or forest health. And so again, looking for mechanisms, we would go lower in scale. So in the case of beetles, we'd look at the interaction of beetles with individual trees and how the beetle affects the trees. And then at a higher scale, we'd say, well, what's the impact of having a bunch of dead trees on an ecosystem and its processes? So the next slide. So again, in looking at the plans that you put forward, we saw kind of proximate, if you will, or one-dimensional views of how we would study the system. So for example, a one-dimensional way of looking at it, and I'm not using this in a pejorative sense at all, it's the immediate proximate way of viewing this, is that we have plants, we had biochar. What's the impact then of biochar on plant growth? And we had experiments set up where we had biochar and no biochar. If we're going to look at this at a kind of a multidimensional thinking or hierarchical thinking, some questions you might want to ask yourself are, what are the connections or global impact of carbon and sequestration of carbon and the effects it has on ecosystems? So what do we learn from this biochar experiment and the effect it might have on larger scale phenomena? What about comparing natural biochar, say, from forest to the biochar from woody biomass? They're not quite the same. Maybe there's a difference there. Is this a proper comparison to make? And then, you know, what aspects of biochar does it change the physical or chemical properties of soil, water retention? What are some mechanisms that could explain differences in plant growth that I know some of the preliminary work that was shown demonstrated? So this is kind of an example of how you might apply this multidimensional or hierarchical thinking in addressing a question or the question that was raised with regard to biochar. So again, we're repeating ourselves a bit here, but this is written in words how we might play this out. So in the biochar experiments, you could view this as having three kind of macroscopic systems to consider. There's the plants, the soil, and the biochar. And we might ask as a first question, what are the relationships among these systems at the observable or macro scale? So this would be at the scale that you are entering. This is that pivotal node that we're talking about when setting up the experiment. So for example, the question you could ask is, does adding biochar to soil help plants grow? And is it possible to do experiments that address this question? But if we think about connecting scales, other questions arise, and this is where we use that pivotal node to go to smaller and for mechanisms and larger scale for significance. So in this case, looking for a mechanism, how does biochar help plants to grow? We'd want to think about some of these subsystems that are at play that are operating at smaller scales. So from a plant's perspective, that might be looking at plant parts, so for example, roots and cells, and then the structure of biochar itself, and then the molecules that are important to plant growth and that biochar interacts with. And we consider what properties and processes at these smaller scales could lead to differences in plant growth for systems that had biochar and systems without. To address the significance and emergent properties, we might ask, well, how does biochar affect the ecological cycling of matter and flow of energy within that system? So we've studied it at a small scale of an individual plant. How might that translate to a plant community or over a landscape if this process is playing out? And why should we care about the effects of biochar on plant growth? I mean, it sounds like a trivial question, but on the other hand, it's, I think, one that we should think about answering. And so we need to think about processes that are happening at this larger scale with larger systems. So for example, at the ecosystem scale, so it might include, in the example here, include a farm. We've got studies, for example, on the western slope looking at biochar and its effect on peach orchards and growth there. We're going to have some teachers look at that. There's studies that are ongoing here at our research farm that are looking at biochar amendments and effects on corn growth. And I know Yamina has studied some of that, sampled some of those plots last year. We're looking at those impacts. And so by studying this in the classroom with individual plants or groups of plants, we can then begin to think about the significance of that at the larger scale, and then maybe duplicate the experiment at that scale, or at least develop hypotheses as to how biochar might affect at that scale. So the basic move that we have here is we're kind of connecting these macroscopic systems and phenomena with their subsystems, and this bigger super system is something that we're trying to get at every unit. And really, hierarchical reasoning is the ability then to take those basic principles and apply it across these different scales. The pivotal node that you enter at, the subsystems that comprise that, and the supersystem that that node is part of. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is, we had one of our grad students kind of tease apart, in this case, a cornfield, looking at how biochar might affect plant growth or corn yield in this case. So the pivotal node here is the scale we're looking at as groups of plants as opposed to an individual plant. But then what he's done is he's described pools, in this case, of carbon and pools of nitrogen, reasoning that these are the biogeochemical processes that are going to be important to plant growth that biochar is likely to affect. He's also looking at different populations. You'll notice that implicit in this are microbes. We have explicit, we have microbial biomass, and then we have the action of microbes on various pools of carbon and nitrogen. And then he's got various components of the plant itself. There's the above ground plant biomass, there's crop residues, there's plant roots, there's below ground litter that's formed as a result of material being incorporated during planting, but also the turnover of plant roots and so forth. So what the student has done here is captured basic processes that interact with that pivotal node, in this case the plant. And that then serves as the framework that we're going to push against next. So the next slide basically sets up a series of hypotheses that says, okay, what happens if we add biochar to this dynamic and in this system? And you'll notice that, for example, in the center of the diagram, where he has soil organic matter, they're saying we're going to see an increase in soil organic matter. And a hypothesis then would say, well, a mechanism will be, well, how could that possibly happen? And it might involve an explanation that includes microbial decomposition, microbial processes, and the relationship of byproducts of that to soils and biochar being a mediator of that. You'll notice that he's seeing a decrease in ammonium and nitrate. So again, we might ask ourselves, well, why might that happen? And you'll see that you're seeing changes in the ammonification processes, possibly being one, or an increase in leaching could be another possibility. So these are, again, are hypotheses or mechanisms that are using then these lower scale phenomena to try to explain how biochar might affect this system, ultimately affecting plant growth. Next slide. Okay. At this stage, what I want to do is to get at an element of practice that that emerged from the discussions, and maybe is it possible for people to ask questions, Beth? Let me ask this.
Sure, they could do it either by unmuting themselves or by typing them into the chat box, either way.
Okay. So if anyone has any questions, this would be a good time to ask, because we're gonna shift to a slightly different mode. Okay, so if there are no questions now, think about what we've talked about, and by all means, feel free to either email us or ask at one of our sessions down the road. Okay, in this practice domain, there are elements of experimental design that I think we need to kind of work on and flesh out. And basically, any time we deal with design, it ultimately comes down to questions that we ask, and then the types of data that we want to collect given the questions we've asked, and then how we framed it. So in the previous slides, we set up two diagrams, one with and one without biochar. We could ask a series of questions, and we gave you some questions that were proximate to the entry-level node, but then also questions about mechanisms and then significance. And so in each of those cases, ultimately, it's that framework that you set up, that the system and the components of that system and the hypotheses that you generate, that's going to define what those questions are. And again, we saw a number of studies that were looking at the primary question of, did biochar affect plant growth? And we're asking that maybe you go to upper and lower scale to look for mechanism on how it might affect plant growth, and then to significance of that at the upper scale. Ultimately, those questions and the hypotheses that you generate, the system that you structure, much as the student did, that's going to dictate the type of data that you collect, and it really will define and spell out what variables you're going to need to measure to make the kinds of comparisons that you're proposing. And so ultimately, it's also going to help define the kind of experiment that you're doing. So in this case, I've listed some different types of data collection, everything from monitoring to comparisons to data collected from manipulative studies to model building, and then there's a whole suite of others. In the case of the biochar experiment, really what we're looking at are comparative studies that result from manipulation. And we have the framework or basis from which to build a simple model if we wanted to take it that far. For the questions regarding the monitoring studies on beetle kill and forest health and so forth, that's a question that's happening at a very large scale, much larger than the biochar question. And I've got that represented here. I put a watershed. What if you were studying an entire watershed? That might require an entirely different experimental setup and design. One that is important to capture what's happening spatially, but then with a rigor that allows you to make judgment or make some estimates or generate, in this case, a map of what's going on over that landscape. So monitoring and sampling would be very important in that context. Next slide. So I've got here kind of a classic setup of experimental designs in the field. These are analogous to what is happening in the classroom or in a schoolyard plot for a biochar experiment. In the case that we have here, just to make it clear, we've got two different types of tundra. The upper one is a dry heath tundra, and the lower one is the moist acidic tundra. In both cases, we have a control, and then we have a site where we added nitrogen. So I think you can see the parallel here. It's pretty easy to pick out the control and the nitrogen on the figure above. The one on the left is a control. You add nitrogen and suddenly the entire plant community changes. So if we were to just look at the proximate, the first order question, we would say, what is the impact in this case of fertilizer, adding fertilizer to growth on the tundra? And we could make measurements about the plant community and properties in soil, and then say, okay, these things changed as a result of those additions. But in terms of looking at mechanisms, then we result to those the models that we had earlier. So, for example, the model being the conceptual model of the relationship of various pools of carbon and nitrogen and biological activity in soil and the effect that it might have on plant growth. So the next step for us to try to explain this observation would then be to get more detail in terms of our sampling shifts and changes, so we can address mechanisms that could explain this beyond the fact that fertilizer was added. How was that affecting plant growth in this case? So the other point that I want to make here is that I've only listed a single comparison here. These these studies were replicated at least 4 times across the landscape. So we had 4 sets of plots. In the case of the studies that you're doing in your classroom, you're definitely going to want to give attention to the amount of replication and the way in which you replicate that in the classroom. Obviously, budget and space is going to be a concern, but this idea of variation, natural variation, but also experimental and introduced variation is going to be really important to convey to students. And so replicating your experiments in the classroom is going to be important. Another aspect of this that's important is a standardization in the way in which data are collected and having those protocols followed. It's very easy for students to be a little bit sloppy or loose with their protocols. We see that with undergraduates and even graduate students, first-year graduate students. And it's the kind of thing where, it can be quite dull, if you will, following these protocols, but it's absolutely critical that we do that so that the data that we get are reflecting the comparisons, the processes that are happening under one scenario or not, and not, just experiment or error. Next slide. Okay. In looking at how these results might play out at a larger scale, I've used this as an example. You could see in the middle here, this is a result of a soil monitoring network that we've established. And there are multiple sites across the country. I've got, the individual samples that are taking place with, you'll notice that there's sampling equipment. There's even a ledger down there, really to illustrate that we have set protocols. We have a sampling regime that covers multiple sites across the country. And then I have a pictorial of a model that's trying to explain the relationships, in this case, of the various variables and why we're collecting the data, and then how we would interpret that data. And then I've got a couple of representations of various properties that we find, so that we can then study trends. The point being is that, again, protocols are adhered to. A conceptual model is used to look at phenomena at one scale and how that might scale up to another scale. And then we have a rigorous experimental design and, in this case, a monitoring regime, the data of which then is used to validate models and to generate patterns, in this case, maps of various variables. Next slide. Here is an example of a study where we're looking at the effect of various plant communities or lack thereof, like in the case of Antarctica, on soils, soil organisms, and so forth. And so, again, in a study like this, we would have a basic understanding of the relationships of soils to plants, or soils and soil organisms to various processes. Again, we've conceptualized that in a general sense. We've applied it to specific sites, and then we've set up a sampling regime that has very strict protocols, rigorous in the sense that we have multiple samples, and then once that information is available, we can then look for patterns across the globe and in a very standardized manner. Next slide. Okay, so having said all that, I'll take a little bit of a break here, and I'm going to turn it over to Beth, because this is the next steps.
Yep, we should ask if there are any questions for John before we move on.
Okay, if there are no questions, by all means, feel free to email them. But I hope what you've seen is how we can take the content domain and the practice domain and look at that in the context of the NGSS, the Next Generation Science Standards, and then apply this this model-based reasoning in terms of framing the questions, designing experiments, and then implementing that experimental design and sampling plan.
Thanks, John.
Yep.
So in terms of moving forward, what we're proposing, or basically, I think that, we all understand that the work that you've been doing so far has been testing things out in your classrooms and bringing ideas and your past experiences, and that, clearly there are some really important concepts and activities that you guys have started to work on, and they're coalescing around these three topics. And so we're starting to think about, okay, this is going to be somewhat of an iterative and developmental process to create materials that we're eventually going to hopefully share more widely. And so what might that process look like? And so what we're hoping to do is to take advantage of the fact that in this BANR project we have all these scientists who are working on these same topics, which are relevant to what we're doing in our classrooms and that can be connected to NGSS. And so we hope to kind of bring together you guys as the teachers, our group, and the BANR scientists to work on these topics and towards materials together, kind of refining the framework that we kind of used as an example with biochar, thinking about how a similar framework might play out with the kind of ecosystems focus and the engineering focus, which is potentially a little bit different because it's engineering rather than kind of scientific. So the how that plays out might be a little bit different for the folks who are working on projects where they're maybe actually engineering biofuels. And then in these groups we'd like to work on really taking that framework and using it to help us align our learning goals, our driving questions at each scale, some shared assessments, and that would play out as activities. So we'd like to, in the coming months, identify some common assessments for each of these groups that you guys will be able to test out with your students and find out kind of what are the ideas that students are bringing to school about these different topics, and use that to help us think about how we need to be responsive to students' ideas, as we engage them in these activities. And then, just continuing to develop the materials, working together with all the resources that we have on hand at BANR. And so what we're proposing to do is, in the fall we were somewhat more set up, or last summer and into the fall of 2004, we were set up where we were kind of providing, presentations and different things at a lot of our meetings. And moving into the spring and summer, we'd like to, really work with you guys to take the time that we have on BANR, these twice monthly webinars, site meetings, and working towards the summer meeting in Colorado, and think about with you guys as groups, like how can we take advantage of this time to work towards these activities. Let's see. And we have a few other kind of BANR opportunities that we just want to keep you guys apprised of, including Amanda recently sent out a notice about the Summer Soil Institute, and that we have several spaces and funding available for teachers who might like to attend that. And then we're also hoping to work on research experiences for teachers, so setting these up with some of the BANR scientists in terms of paid opportunities for you guys to get out into the field and work with some of the BANR folks on different projects and studies that they're undertaking, with the hope that that can then come back and inform the work that we're doing in your classrooms and working on the BANR materials. So I think that's all we have. Does anyone else, John or Amanda or Sylvia might be gone, have comments on that? Or if folks have questions or comments? I think we just have a few more minutes until 5. Okay. John, any parting thoughts?
Oh, this is Amanda.
You left?
John just left. He had to go.
Okay.
So he said to tell you all thank you and talk to you soon.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
Beth, our next webinar is in 2 weeks?
Yes.
Okay. And is it going to be a guest speaker, do we know?
I don't think we know yet.
Okay. All right, just checking.
Okay. And I mean, that does play into sort of what we're talking about here, where we want to hear from you guys about what the best use of our, kind of dedicated BANR time will be. Like, are there more presentations that you guys are interested in? Are you wanting to take the webinar time to work in these, 3 research groups and work on frameworks and assessments and those kinds of things? So please do email us with your thoughts on kind of those next steps and what you guys perceive will be the best use of your admittedly very limited time as teachers. Okay. Thanks very much, folks, and we'll talk to you in a few weeks.